thing is we'll send you, we also have a change toolkit, which has got a lot of the resources I'm talking about here as downloadable resources in it that you can, if you want to have Word documents and things, for example, the change communication, we'll send you a link to that, which means you can just download these tools if should you need it. All right, so using the chat, so we've got you warmed up on the chat. Carol so far gets the award for the person we most want to be located nearby in Antigua. Why does change fail in your opinion? Tell me, when you've experienced change, what's caused a problem? Why do you think it's changed? Why has it failed in your opinion? Give me some thoughts on that. What are the causes that cause it problem? It always takes a little while for the chat to come through to catch up with your thoughts. Well done, those straight on there. So lack of communication, says George and Alex, absolutely. Poor communication, and you're absolutely right. A lack of it, confusing or poor timing. And the interesting thing, Kotter, who is the change guru, has written loads on it. Kotter has a quote which says that you need to communicate change 10 times more than you think you do. And I think that's one of the reasons often people think, who are leading the change, they think they've told everybody, but telling someone people to do something isn't the same as them actually doing it. So having that communication plan. Glenn's saying poorly resourced, so maybe not having the right people in the right places at the right time. And that's definitely something I'll allude to when we look at the Kotter model. Adoption from the organisation. So why don't people, it fails because people don't adopt it, but why don't they adopt it? And it is down to often the communication and the resources that causes that. Yet maybe people don't understand what's required of them, misunderstanding, and it's not been clear enough. Yes, Carol, that's another one, vision, and Jan. Yeah, vision and leadership. So creating and communicating that vision, and people not sponsoring and leading that change, and then potentially not taking people with them in terms of stakeholders. We've got to engage, Richard, haven't we, with our stakeholders, and they can be blockers or they can be drivers. So those absolutely fit in there. Seeing it as an event rather than an ongoing process. That's true, Mark, isn't it? Because you don't necessarily get there, particularly with system change, seeing it as an ongoing thing. People go, okay, we've rolled something out, that's done, job done. That's really often something that happens with system change. We roll something out and think it's actually, yeah, everything's happening, but that is not the same as people actually using something. Fear of change, fear of failure, says Lisa. It not being given sufficient change. Absolutely, all of these are excellent reasons why change fails. Sengia, quite like this quote. If you're thinking about people being changed, and this links into things like leadership, communication, stakeholders, people don't resist change, they resist being changed. So if they think something's being imposed on them, they don't understand why, they may choose to resist it. If they haven't bought into it from the point of view of it being sponsored or having a clear vision, they don't understand the rationale for it. All of those can actually create reasons why people become resistant to change and makes it difficult. Yeah, so all of these things, it's about people. Have I got anything that you haven't covered? I don't think so. I'm just saying the same things in different ways. And maybe the poorly thought through. Sometimes there are obstacles which haven't been considered, and I'll pick that up on the Kotter point. Sense of urgency is often about communication. It's not been clearly, there isn't a compelling event or a reason for people to know what to do. So there's nothing that pushes people to change. And those of you who attended my first webinar, we talked about the burning platform, people moving away from pain and towards a goal or a positive, and you need both or one, at least one or the other, to be compelling enough to get people to make that decision to change. And that other one there, seeing it, Mark's point about seeing it as an event as opposed to a process, that's because often we stop and we don't have that impetus and follow through. So referring to some of the models that we should think about when we're considering change, and I'm talking large scale change, although you could apply it to an individual, I guess, as well. So Lewin, he talked about change and said you have to think about it as a process of unfreezing and taking it through to refreezing. So it's something where you've got to consider where are we currently and what do we need to do to make that change. And I think of it as a silly analogy maybe, but let's say you've got ice cubes in a particular shape. You've got square ice cubes and you want them to be those lovely round ones that you can put in your gin and tonic. Well, you can't just put a square ice cube in the round gin and tonic making ice cube maker. You can't do that. Nothing will happen. You have to unfreeze it, to take it back to water, to then refreeze it. And we have to think about this in terms of, we have to get people to engage with us. There's lots of curves in change. So I see this as an unfreezing and refreezing, but the other curve, of course, getting people to think about change, that change curve that we talked about on the first one, which is where people need to move from denial, where they're frozen in an old way of being, through resistance, exploration, and into commitment to a new way. So they kind of fit together in terms of that. So we're thinking about unfreezing. You have to unfreeze in order to then make a change and then refreeze. And that's that consolidation. It's not just stopping when you've made the change. It's about embedding that change and making it totally fit. So if we then apply that approach to Kotter's 8-step change model, John Kotter, and he's done lots of books, including Our Iceberg is Melting, which is one of them, which is a story about penguins, if you're wondering why I've got penguins on here. So in terms of unfreezing an organisation, what we would talk about is we have to start by creating some sort of sense of urgency. So helping people to think, oh, I actually do need to do this. Why should I do it now? Because ultimately this status quo is so much easier. It's always easier not to do anything. However desirable a change might be, it's easier to do nothing. So one of the ways of doing this is identifying a potential crisis or a major opportunity. So it could be something that's going to go horribly wrong if we don't change. It could be that we are, we're going to run out of money as a business, or there's a huge deal that if we restructure, we could win this business, and it would keep us afloat for the next however many years as a business, or it'd be great kudos, whatever it might be. So we have to identify something, and this would link back when I've talked previously about the why. So those of you who are on the webinar last week, a lot of these talked about things that are often missed in communication, and why, explaining why the change is necessary or desirable was one of the frequently missed things. And that can create that sense of urgency. So starting by identifying what that crisis is or a major opportunity. And as I'm going through these, try and think of a change that you've experienced in your organisation, because on the next slide, I'm going to ask you where you think a change typically fails or breaks down. So if the change is going on, so maybe think of a large scale change that you've experienced or witnessed, and think of where it might have broken down. There might be more than one place. So start off by identifying why we need to do it. Quite often, this early bit, this unfreezing, is done just by a very small group of people, not quite in the ivory towers, but it might be happening at senior management if it's an organisation-wide change. They then need to work out how many people you need to lead that change. And this is an interesting one, because you need to form a powerful guiding coalition. Now, that is interesting because you've got to have the right people in it. And so have you got the right people in that group who know enough in terms of maybe the change that needs to happen, but are also equipped and skilled at leading change? And that's an interesting one as where you can see that challenges may sometimes arise. Sometimes the change has to be confidential, so it has to be a small group of people, and that can introduce risk, but it could also be risky having too many people. And then we need to talk about this vision. And again, so this vision is the why. So we may have a business reason why we need to do this, but we need to explain the story, the vision, in a way that is inspiring to others to be motivated to change. And we have this vision of the why we're doing this and how we're going to do it in terms of the strategies. And thinking about that vision in language, when we go on to the next stage about communicating it, that is going to appeal to different people. So at a shareholder level, for example, a specific vision, might be it's going to make more money. That isn't going to motivate people who work in a manufacturing plant necessarily, because they don't see any of the shareholder price. So they might be more motivated by, if we go to this new structure, we'll have better working practices, or better shifts, or something like that, or greater resources. Excuse me. So you need to create this vision and then be prepared to communicate that vision, and use every method possible to communicate this new direction. And that links back to one of the points we made earlier about the fact that you need to make sure that you communicate it more than you think you need to do it. Because often we don't do it. And as Kotter said earlier, and we said earlier about Kotter, is that people often think they've communicated enough, but in actual fact, they really haven't. Excuse me, I just had a cough. Okay, so we've communicated the vision. So then what we need to think about is, well, we're making this change. We've told people about the change, but we were alluding to in some of the points that you were saying is it's not been embedded. And actually, at this point, we're communicating it, but is that the same as the change happening? So we need to keep on moving that change forward. And it might be removing obstacles, which could be people, or it could be system obstacles. Let's think of an example where I've seen companies try to roll out, let's say, a new expenses system, but they've still got the old one in place. So why are people going to stop using the old one until they have to? If you think about when Apple updates or Microsoft updates, whatever it is, when you have something, they're going, oh, do you want to go to the new version? Those go, oh no, I don't want to learn a new one. You leave it as long as possible until it's forced on you. So there is something where how can you empower people or remove obstacles to people doing that? And you eventually have to take away the old way in order to get people to move forwards potentially. Then it's about creating short-term wins. So helping people see why this is a good thing. And you can see why this short-term win is where you start to encourage people who are laggards. So, there might be some people who go, oh yeah, I love this new expenses system, and they rush around and they're using it and singing its benefits. What you need to do is like recognize those people or get them to be saying, oh, this is saving me so much time, or this is something that's so useful. Recognize, reward, shout about it. It's a positive way of communicating that this change is coming and it's here to stay. And this is a really good way that then those people who are sort of sitting in resistance or even denial realize, oh, I think I'm actually going to have to move on to this new system, because it looks like, oh, well, they're all saying it. Some of them will go, oh, it looks like it's better than I thought it was going to be because XYZ person is saying it's great. But the other thing, of course, is that they're able to, that they can see that actually it's still being promoted. People are still going on about it. They didn't just say, use the new expenses system and leave it at that. They're still banging on about it. I think I'm going to actually have to do it. So we need to be persistent. It's an ongoing process. So then you get to the short-term wins, and often changes do get to this point, and the celebration of, the new deal that was won with the new company structure or the new brand name, or the first deal in this new product. But then we have to refreeze, because you can slip back. That's the problem. If we only do a little bit, all those positive, enthusiastic people have gone around and done the new thing. But people, again, old habits, we slide back round into our old habits unless we consolidate that change. So we have to keep the energy. We need to keep on making this business as usual, making it repetitive. And that helps you to consolidate and anchor the changes. And where I've done that, when we've rolled out performance management, for example, where we're working with people, is it maybe you roll something out in stages. So you get your initial appraisal functionality and start with, and then a little bit later you bring in the recognition. So something exciting for people that's still there. So they need to be using the first bit in order to use the second bit. And then you might next year to put in talent management or 360 feedback. So there's something that's you keep on the program, which is all actually reinforcing the original change, which was going online with performance management, but by building on it step by step, as opposed to big bang where it's too scary a change for everybody and they avoid it all altogether. You're consolidating it and you're embedding it. And then anchoring the changes for me is helping building it into business as usual. So making sure that your processes automatically use your new expenses system, your new performance management system. It doesn't have to be a system, just thinking of those. And other things would be sponsors, for example. So it might be put in that the monthly board report is that they communicate uptake. How many people have had check-ins or one-to-ones in this month or quarter. And you could have something like a sort of a competition between the areas, nothing like a bit of competition at board level where the sales director versus the ops director versus the customer service director have all got different percentages of usage of whatever brand new system it is, and there's nothing like that little bit of visibility at that level that will motivate that adoption and get people to take it on and absolutely drive it, sponsor it from the top down. Because quite a lot of these things you have your group of people who are in the powerful guiding coalition, but you've ultimately got to get that sponsorship across leadership and get them to buy in and see it as equally important. So hopefully I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but you've had enough there to be able to explain what each of those 8 steps are. So if I was to ask you, which stage, in your opinion, do you think it commonly fails? And let me launch this. See whether you're able to say 1 or 2. I can't remember. It's multiple choice. So let's say you can choose 2. where do you think change commonly fails in your experience? And obviously it could fail at any of them, but I have a theory. I'll see whether you reinforce my theory or not, as to how about this happens. It's quite a challenging one, this, and you have got to think about it. Okay, great, 55%. Oh, whizzing up. Excellent. Okay, 88%. I think that's probably enough to share it. So here, I think we've gone everywhere. It's fairly balanced view, isn't it? And that isn't incorrect at all. One of my theories, and this has been more, I used to train on this when we used to get people to really talk through a change and work out where something had broken down ultimately within a large organisation that many of you know that I've worked for. And what we used to find is that quite often these points were, so between creating a vision and communicating, it's you get to communication and then stop, as I alluded to earlier. So you did communication and think that's enough to make the change happen. And the other one was consolidation. They wouldn't go up that curve again at the end. So it's almost in the breaks in colour, or the breaks between unfreeze and change and refreeze, that was often a common sort of almost like we think the change is over. They think it was going back to the point about it being a process as opposed to something that's still ongoing. So that refreezing wouldn't happen. And I think that's where you don't get good uptake, or when you don't get good adoption from an organisation, it's quite likely that it's just been communicated and there's not been that additional bit that's gone on, or it's not been properly consolidated. That change hasn't, the energy isn't still there. That's not to say any of the others can't cause problems as well, but that was just my theory. So I suppose what I would say is just be careful at those areas, because I think those are particular risk areas. I totally agree with your feedback that's coming through the chat there. So having done our poll, given that most of us that are here potentially are going to be change agents or change champions within an organisation, how can we use this model? So one of the things I think we need to do is where we slot in these different behaviours as we go through it. So at the start, creating that sense of urgency, you need to make sure that there's clear sponsorship that supports the urgency, and it's about ensuring that people know exactly what's expected and by when. So setting in artificial deadlines is really helpful, and also making sure that people understand the why. So we talked about the why. So why is it strategically important? Why is it a problem if we don't do it? So that motivation, the towards and away motivation, make sure we understand that, be ready to communicate it, but also being really clear, what is the change and by when, so that people recognize it. So you need to put a date, you need to be clear. Performance management, you're rolling out a performance management system. We expect 85% of people, or 90%, or whatever the number is, I wouldn't go with 100%, 90% of people to have had 3 objectives agreed in the system by the 30th of April, right? Because by setting those, you can really clear about what the expectation is, and very importantly, you can measure whether it's happened or not, and you can follow up. So there's something there in terms of that start and end. That's a very specific one about implementing something there. But in terms of a change of an organisation, say a restructure, then it's identifying when will we be the new structure, when will this have been implemented by, and having that deadline and clarity in place with that project plan. Then about the powerful guiding coalition, including the right people, and right people, for me, I've seen changes fail because somebody who has the technical knowledge wasn't included early enough. So, let's say you're rolling out SAP or something, which is quite expert, and know someone who understands the nitty gritty of how to invoice key customers using the previous tool hasn't been engaged, and suddenly the timelines are all wrong, or something's not achievable. So there is something to make sure you've got the right people with the right technical knowledge at the right time. In there, maybe initially, if it has to be kept very quiet, you have a small coalition, but you may have to do a loop again. I've worked with an organisation where they're rolling something out internationally, and they hadn't consulted the local HR business partners, and it would have all gone horribly wrong if they hadn't built in a bit of extra time for that second guiding coalition to be involved, engaged, to be champions and super users, to put their expertise in, to flag where things might go wrong. So those things could be flushed out before the change was implemented. It seems obvious, but it often is overlooked. But then on top of that, I would also think about the people who are naturally engaging, people who are positive about change, or people who are negative about change that you get on board, because, and we'll talk about that in stakeholders later, and involve them, include them. The vision I talked about, it needs to be exciting, not really dull, and it needs to be relevant. So I talked about that previously in terms of making sure that it's relevant to the audience. So creating that vision that's appealing to different levels of the organisation, and to make sure that it's communicated in language that feels that way. Have a senior convincing sponsor when you're doing the communication, and that's going to appeal to people or sponsors better, and make sure that people have a chance to reflect, ask questions. It's not just a tell, here's an email, you're going to do this. You've got to give people a chance to engage with the change, to commit to it, to talk about it, to explore it. Remember, if you're on the first one I talked about, resistance, actually when people ask questions, even difficult questions, it's probably better than them staying silent, because they are at least engaging. They've moved out of denial. Silence is not necessarily commitment. Shouting about short-term wins, have a word with the people who are doing nothing. So be really visible about the people who are making it a success. Shout, make that very, very visible. Those people who don't appear to be doing it, have a quiet word initially. This is when you're going through the change. Later on, you can name and shame later, but initially just nudge them along. And then I think consolidated change, particularly with large scale change, it's quite helpful to consider refreshing your change team. I think about someone like myself, I would often be involved in change to start with. If you're a starter, it's great at starting things, but I'm not very good at dotting I's and crossing the T's. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to bring in new people who are more implementers at this consolidation stage. Plan to do that. Those people who are good at dotting the I's, crossing the T's, getting things pushed through and turning something into business as usual. So that's something I think you can intend to do and plan to do, and make sure, just being very clear if you're the change agent about what that part of that role is, and choose those people with the right skills. And then implement monitoring and checks for some time afterwards. I was talking about that, make sure it's part of the board report, or it's something we report on in a dashboard, or whatever it is, so that you're monitoring that change has been embedded, as opposed to just thinking it has. So you need some sort of way of reporting or measures. And of course, if you didn't set those clear goals and measures in the first place, then you wouldn't have that. So that's quite key. So that's a way of positioning Kotter. Feel free to put any questions or comments if anyone's got any. And we're going to keep going at a reasonable pace. There's quite a bit of content here today. Don't worry, I'll still get you finished by 1:15. But just wanted to go through those. So the other thing you could think about if you're planning change, and lots of these are similar ways of doing the same thing, but you may have come across force field analysis. If you're planning on that change, you might think, okay, what are going to be the positive, the positive forces for change? What's going to motivate people to do it, and what are the blockers going to be? So thinking about, how might we become unstuck? And this is thinking about those obstacles in the middle of that Kotter thing. How do we avoid those obstacles, or sort of unblock them early? So it could be, driving forces are people are really irritated with an old system, or people are motivated to do something. You might think, oh, our staff survey told us that people are really fed up about something. So a driving force could be the fact that people are peeved about something, and they want to they've told us that they want something different. So that could be a driving force and motivator for change, because they've already said that they want to do this. You could have people who've experienced this positively before. You've got positive change agents, people who are vested or are stand to benefit in some way. So those are going to be driving forces. Of course, the opposite is also true. People who are invested and stand to lose something, or perceive they're going to lose something, could be restraining forces. Lack of urgency can be a restraining force. People who are negative generally about something, or maybe other changes are going on at the same time, could be a blocker. So it's just trying to think, what are they, and then you can almost chip away at each one in turn. You can approach each one and identify, what do I need to do to overcome this blocker, or how can I bolster up this driving force? So thinking about those are all good ways when you're planning your change, just diving in. And the other thing is thinking about it in terms of actual stakeholders. So you could think, who are the key stakeholders in our organisation? So it could be key sponsors, the external stakeholders, it could be customers, could be, you could categorize all the different types of stakeholders that there are, and think about them in terms of how much power have they got in relation to this change. So it could be positional power, but it also could be that they are actually, they may not be very senior, but they've got quite a lot of personal power in the organization. So, or they could be a massive customer, and if they decide to leave and don't like something, then that's really powerful. Second one is, how interested are they in the change? So, you know, your hugest customer really probably doesn't care that much about your expenses system, so they've got low interest, doesn't really matter. Whereas someone, they might be really interested in your invoicing system, and how you're going to do that and what the impact might be on payment terms or something. So thinking about those in terms of your stakeholder analysis allows you to think about how you might address treat them. So obviously your key players, the ones that you've got high power and high interest, things like trade unions, if you're doing salaries or something, that would be a key one, because you need to potentially, well, it depends on how influential the trade union is, of course, they could be a key player. You need to engage directly with them. You need to get their buy-in. You need to hear their thoughts and concerns, and ideally get them to sponsor or champion it so that they're on side. And then you need to keep close to them, keep them on side as you go through. Then if you look at the high influence but low interest, the latents, then I think that's about just making sure you don't overlook them, because they could suddenly become interested, or they might be interested because someone else they work with closely is interested. So you still need to communicate with them and keep them on board and see if they'll potentially be a sponsor of something. The defenders have got high interest but low influence. Well, out of courtesy, you should still communicate effectively with them, even if you don't think they can influence much. But, you know, maybe it's about seeing whether they would, I'm sorry, I've got it round up, so one way around in terms of their interest. Yeah, don't overlook them, but check in with them at the start, but you don't need to spend as much time managing them. Sorry, that's latent. I'm getting myself muddled. The defenders, I'm thinking, keep them informed. You need to make, they've got the interest. Don't neglect them, is what I would say. And then in terms of our lower priority ones, it's about just making sure that you just keep an eye on them, check they haven't stepped into one of the other quadrants in terms of these things. So that's quite common sense, isn't it? But it's just another way in which you could target your resource. And if you're working with a change team, you might identify you've got a bunch of people who are key players. How are you going to divvy them up between you to go and talk to them, and make sure that perhaps some of them need to have one-to-one conversations rather than just generalized conversations. Those of you who attended last week might remember I talked about a key person in my previous employer, who was just someone who would say no for the sake of it, and you just had to go and talk to him personally to get it was about his ego, in my opinion, but you got him on side, then everything else would fall into place. And that links into what we might talk about, cultural challenges. So these are examples. I go into these in a little bit more detail in my book, but you might recognize one of these in companies that you work with currently or haven't worked with. There might be subcultures of certain people. So let's say some organizations, they have a sort of no culture, or feel like you've got a bit of a no culture. They may be naturally cynical. Maybe it's lots of scientists or engineers or something who are just a bit of a naturally risk-averse culture. In that situation, it'll take a little bit longer to be persuaded to change. They want to know that all the risks have been mitigated. So you need to think about that. It's largely about overcoming fear and making sure, and they don't necessarily like too much urgency either. So you need to reassure them that you've been thorough, all the risks have been discussed, and explore that, and may have to go into a little bit more detail to get them on board. So it's not they want to say no, they just want to say no until they're confident that their fear has been alleviated. There's this not invented here, itis. So those people who kind of, if they're part of it, then they're on board. If they're not, then they kind of automatically resist. So for me, that's about ego. That's the person that I was talking to before. So you need to involve them and let them think that they did invent it, or at least they participated in it and contributed to it. You've got others, and obviously you can have multiple examples of this within your organization. You've got those others who kind of will play lip service to something. They play the game, so they'll go, yeah, obviously I'm along with it. They'll sort of say they're going to do something, but that for me is, are they actually committed to change, or are they just in denial? They'll just go, oh, let's keep my head down, it'll go away. So they pay lip service, but then do absolutely diddly squat. So those ones, you've got to call them out. So you've got to make sure that this is where you've got to go, this is what you need to do by when. So this is the importance of having specific goals. There need to be consequences of people not doing it. And you need to give them chance to, to actually express what they think. You need to pull them out of denial into resistance at the very least. Keeping up with the Joneses / laggards, it's kind of people who want others before they'll do it. So they're not going to be the early adopters, but if they see that someone really influential in their business, so they're kind of the followers. So that's why you need to communicate the quick wins. They're the sort of people who go, oh, hang on a minute, Fred over in accounting has already done this, it's completed all of his appraisals. Right, I'd better go on and do it. If he's doing it, then I'd better do it. So that kind of thing, you're giving them social proof as the motivator there. And then after the meeting ends, the debate begins is a bit the sort of lip service. Is where people appear to be going on with it, but the actual conflict, they're going bitch about it, so I think it's a better word, out of in the back. So the conflict, they act like it's all going to happen, but then they conflict later. The best thing that you've got to try and it's a bit like playing the game, actually. You have to elicit that conflict up front. So you might say, what challenges do you see about this, or what risks, or what are the disadvantages of this approach? You have to try and get them talking about it overtly rather than covertly, because then at least you can deal with it and address it and move them then from resistance into exploration. It's really hard to deal with it if it's all going on behind the scenes. So those are just some examples of very high level ways in which you can approach it. I mean, the bottom line is, to be a change agent, you have to be pretty flexible and prepared to roll up your sleeves and get involved and talk to people and sell. It's like a sales job. You've got to sell people on this change, on this concept. You can't just kind of do it without emotion and expect people to passion and drive to take people with you. And then linking to communication, this model, Bernice McCarthy came up with the format model, and I think this is useful when you are creating communication to ensure you've got all these bases covered. So again, the why, if anything can take away from this series, why is really important. Starting off with why we need to do this, then explaining what does it actually entail, how, practical steps and timings, and then the what if, which is kind of the motivation bit. What happens if we don't do anything? So the risk, the kind of the away motivation, and what's the positive motivation? What happens if we do something? So if I gave you an example, we might say we need to cut costs. Let's say there's a cost cutting exercise. Why do we need to do it? Well, our parent company is demanding cost savings to deliver greater profitability, or it could be something like, interest rates have gone up, so our borrowing rates have gone up massively, so we have to cost cut. How are we going to do this, or what does this actually entail? Well, we need to move people from working shifts, let's say, that are fixed shifts, to a more variable, demand-led working pattern. So people aren't necessarily going to like that, right? That's changed. They're kind of having to be flexible. So why do we need to? When are we going to start doing? Well, we'll do it in this way. These are the numbers of shifts people have. You have to give them the practicalities, and it will be communicated by this date and rolled out by this date. So you tell people when it's actually going to step in, as much practical information as you can offer. What happens if we don't do this? Well, this is an interesting one, actually. How negative you want to be, it depends. I don't know that I would always give both, but because they're flips of the same thing. You could say, if we don't do this, we may have to close the UK depot, or you could say, by doing this, we can be sure the UK depot will remain open for the foreseeable future. The reality is they're both the same point. Some's more powerful than others. Some would say you need to position both in order to be both away motivated and towards motivated. So helping people understand the consequence. Now, again, often if we don't do that, people go, okay, why? Well, we need to do it. It cost savings, just need to save money. But actually helping people realize the implication of not doing it, you go, okay, that would be really bad if we had to shut the UK depot. Everyone would be out of a job, right? So it kind of makes the why practical. And there's in the toolkit, there's a document that you can use this if you wanted to refer back to it. So I'm not saying use this in a very a completely rote way, because it could seem a little bit automated, almost robotic, but do make sure that you cover all these bases. And actually, if you communicate stuff, so whether this is a written communication, an email, or whether this is verbal communication, you're going to answer a whole load of questions and prevent a whole load of questions if you actually cover all of these bases and have these messages established up front. Okay, so I've covered quite a lot of content here. I'm going to pause and take a breath, and if anyone has any questions or observations, I realised actually it was less interactive than many of those because I had a lot of content, but I hope you found it valuable content. Really happy to answer any personal questions. If anyone wants to stay on the line, feel free to do so. Did I miss a poll? I feel like I might have missed a poll. Just check. Oh, no, okay. We've got one about topics. I'm going to put one up here if you've got any topic suggestions for webinars. Actually, I'll say perhaps do that in the chat. What I'll do is I'll also pop up, if anyone wants us to follow up on any of the things that we offer, I will do that. You'll automatically get links to the slides and these resources. Our next series of webinars, we think we're going to make it kind of strategy related. So like how to do a HR or a training L&D strategy, things like building a balanced scorecard if you really want to be data-based, and learning strategy. So we thought we might do something like that, because that's can be a sort of a challenging thing. Love to know if you think that's a good idea or not. Would you be interested in us doing that as a series? And what other topics, if not, what topics would you love me to do webinars on? So we're just trying to do more of them. And if you want to know anything about what we offer, I think I won't let me share that for some reason. Oh, thank you. I forgot to end that one. Thanks. Have you taken over, Caitlin? Caitlin's sorting the polls out for me. So if you wanted to follow up on anything, please do so. So I'm not seeing anything coming through the chat. I'll give it a bit longer if anyone else wants to. But retention strategy. Okay, so I think that's about talent, isn't it? How to retain, that would be retention and engagement. I would say, Lakita, is where the angle I'd go down there. Talent retention, so but maybe it's badged that way. How to keep people engaged. Yeah, retaining leavers. Yeah, great, brilliant. Well, thanks ever so much for joining and interacting, and it was really great to have a good audience here again, and hope to see you on future webinars. Keep an eye out for an email from Caitlin. Good, Carol. I'm really pleased to do that. Please, you found it useful. And obviously you could follow up if you want to know more of. I've got an audio book, and a lot of this is in my actual book and audio book, which is quite easy to refer to if that's something you want to understand more about. Thanks for joining. I'm going to close this down and go and grab my lunch because I didn't have time to have it before. Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.